Can humanity live without bread and games? Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 debate. Yeah, we've had 2 months to reflect on the lack of sports here in Europe with the suspension of both spectator sports and most exercise as we know it. Now we're seeing the easing of confinement. Even in Germany, though, where the Bundesliga restarted this past weekend, it's hardly what you'd call back to normal, what with matches played before empty stadiums and strict rules that even include a ban on goal celebration hugs. When is the right time to return? While Scotland's the latest nation to cancel its season, England's premiership still talks up what it's branded as Project Restart, and teams this Tuesday resumed training. How do players and fans feel? What will be the impact of this hiatus on the major sports, both at the top flight, but also at the grassroots level? And more broadly, what future for contact sports like rugby? If social distancing is the new norm, what about that gym membership? And how are we any different after a hiatus where, well, the sounds of birds tweeting has replaced the roar of the crowd? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at how sports might be changing as a result of coronavirus. And with us to talk about it, she led England in goal to the Final Four of last year's Women's World Cup. Carly Telford is the Chelsea goalkeeper. Thank you for joining us from Wolverhampton.
Thank you for having me.
We want to welcome. Well, we're doing fine here. We're also in the company, confined to the French capital, is Financial Times columnist Simon Cooper, who you can read every Saturday, most notably, and who is one of the co-founders of Pandemonium U. Tell us what Pandemonium U is.
It's a free online university. Look it up online. We have wonderful courses. David Kurtzer is next, talking about the Vatican's secret World War II archive on Wednesday.
And this is a project you began since the start of confinement.
Yeah, me and my wife, Pamela Druckerman, we set up for anyone who wants to learn, since everyone is in lockdown and looking for useful things to do. Doing it for 2 months has been huge fun. I've learned a lot myself, even our children have.
Well, if you're in lockdown, there's worse places to be than Giverny, where the Claude Monet, the Impressionist painter's home is. Ian Holyman is the producer and co-host of the Ligue 1 podcast and sports journalist. Thank you for joining us, Ian.
It's a pleasure, Francois. Hello.
I hope you've learned a lot over the last 2 months.
Well, there was a lot to learn.
All right. Well, let's get straight to it. We're all wondering what it would be like to have football back. And it's back, well, a little bit in Germany. James Wilson has more.
Saturday was match day in the German city of Dortmund. With no music, mascots or crowds, the game between Borussia Dortmund and Schalke seemed more like a casual kick-around than a match in Germany's prestigious Bundesliga. And to make sure no fans turned up to celebrate outside the stadium, police were deployed to keep an eye on things.
Aber tatsächlich muss ich sagen, bis jetzt ist es wirklich sehr ruhig in der Stadt und wenn wir über Infektionsgefahren reden, kann ich bis jetzt die Fans, die Dortmunder oder wie auch immer nur loben, denn bis jetzt ist es sehr ruhig und offensichtlich sind viele dem Appell gefolgt, zu Hause zu bleiben, das Spiel zu Hause zu sehen und ich glaube, das ist genau die richtige Vorgehensweise.
The Bundesliga was suspended in March, but authorities have decided it is now safe for matches to be held behind closed doors. A number of clubs have reported financial difficulties and were keen for the season to resume. But for Schalke fans, many will be wishing the league had remained suspended for a while longer, after their team were comprehensively beaten 4-0 by Borussia Dortmund.
Nein, Derby-Niederlagen prinzipiell sind unangenehm und diese heute natürlich auch wenn es eine ganz skurrile Atmosphäre war und ein ganz ungewöhnliches Spiel.
The Bundesliga is the first major European football league to restart, while other countries say they hope football matches can begin again in June.
Ian Holyman, we had that bizarre image after the game where the Dortmund fans went before the stand where their most diehard supporters are normally and did this kind of celebration for empty seats. Did they do the right thing restarting?
I think it's still too early to say. I mean, in terms of infections or potential infections from contact between players during the game, we'll have to wait and see whether any symptoms develop over the 18 teams in the Bundesliga. That may well be a week, 2 weeks in coming. Hopefully there won't be. Hopefully it will pass off well. They certainly put everything in place, as you saw there, not only in terms of the police, but also any media who were present. Balls were being disinfected before play started. So they certainly put every single measure possible in place. But again, still really too early to say whether they should have started or not.
Too early to say, Simon Cooper?
I think Germany is in a privileged situation. I mean, much more than the countries to the west. They have the virus more under control. They have adequate testing. And so it's logical that they would be able to start their league before the Italians, the English, or the Spanish. It's also possible that going into next season, Germany will be ahead of the curve, maybe even letting a few fans into stadiums. And then you could see big players who might be inactive in other leagues thinking, well, should I transfer to a league that actually is playing football?
But can you have football without fans?
Well, football has increasingly over the last 30 years become TV content. And for financially, the fans in the stadium are just window dressing. They make it look more like an event. And so, yes, you can have football without fans. Obviously, it's second best, but it's better than no football. And so if Bayern Munich are playing without fans, you will get a lot of people watching, whereas in England, nobody is playing. And so that gives Bayern Munich an enormous competitive advantage on the whole Bundesliga over the English teams.
Yeah, and we're seeing this sort of pressure to restart in England. The back page of today's Daily Mirror, Carly Telford making a pun about the fact that they've restarted in Germany and not yet in England. We're all wondering whether or not it's right to restart. What was your reaction looking at the games from last weekend?
I miss it, how much I miss it. I think we all feel the same. I think there was a big build up into that weekend, finally seeing some live football, which we've all kind of missed and craved, just live sport in general. And then there was kind of this big excitement and then a little bit of a lull when we realised how important I think fans are to the game. But yeah, here in England, as much as in Spain, Italy, Germany, we're desperate for football to start again. It's part of, I guess, our everyday life here, whether it's we're reading on the back pages about what's happening in transfers, results, games, and it's that time of the season that everyone looks forward to. It's the end. It's the pinnacle of what we all play for. So yeah, it's frustrating, but it's the right thing to do, is to wait and to see that everyone can complete it safely. I think that's the main thing.
What's been your routine during this time? Are you in training as if you could restart tomorrow, or did you take a break?
It was a mixture of both. I think initially we were put into individual training programs. We were kind of sent off of Cobham, just like the men's team, and told to isolate with family or friends or whoever it was we were supposed to be with. We were staying there for a period of time, and that was kind of our bubble. That was who you were staying with for the foreseeable future. Sent individual programs, which we kind of have been adhering to for the past 12 weeks. Some of us went to the World Cup last year, so notably we've been going for about 11 months. And if the season is to resume, we potentially could go into July, August, which would have been our time off. So yeah, I think it's important that some of us have had 2 or 3 weeks within there where we've reduced our training levels and not being kind of every day on the pavements or on the football pitches locally. But mostly it's just been training and taking over, and every week we've had Zoom calls. We're feeding back what the league meetings were, what the Premiership are putting in place, and whether the WSL, which is the women's league here, can implement those same things so that we are as safe as the men when we come back.
Yeah, because for anybody who's played some kind of a team sport or any competitive sport, you don't have fond memories of preseason training, right? It's grueling. You've got to do all this. You got to do all this physical exercise before you can get to the actual playing bit. To stop it, to start it, to stop it, to start it again. That's got to be tough.
Yeah, it's been awful, especially for me. I'm a goalkeeper, so I don't like running in to start with. So to be told that that's going to be the main bit of my training from now on has been it's like it's been back in the old school days. So when we weren't full time, it's a lot of kind of off your own, a lot of self motivation. A lot of the time you forget how important your teammates are and seeing them every day, and they get you through training on your good and bad days. But for now, it's just kind of up to you. Chelsea have been really good and not made us do things collectively and report religiously on what we've been doing. So again, you could have took this as a massive break and just sat down and chilled. But I think with the likes of us, if the season is to resume, we are second place with a game in hand. And we know how important it is going to be if we are going to restart to getting our hands on that trophy. So for us, it's kind of in the bad days, dragging yourself out of bed and making sure you do the training. Because if it does get restarted, we want to make sure we're all in the best position to make sure we can complete the season as champions.
Ian Holyman, when you contrast that with France, where they've said, look, let's forget it, or Scotland is the latest, announcing on Monday that the season's over. Your thoughts on that?
I think that the French Football League's hands were tied somewhat by the government's decision that major sport could not be played until September. They had absolutely no choice. Of course, even the UEFA president has come out and said that it was premature. I just wanted to come back on something actually that Simon said. I absolutely take the point. He's absolutely right that football has become very TV based. However, I think if one thing we can learn from what we saw on Saturday, and I think the fact that it was a derby between Dortmund and Schalke. I've been present at one of these games. Normally inside that stadium, there's 81,000 people. I've tried to commentate a game there with headphones on. You can't hear yourself talk, even in the headphones. And Carly said how important the fans are to the players. I think it brought into really stark relief just how much the fans were missing. I mean, the Dortmund Schalke is titled the mother of all derbies. This wasn't even the second cousin twice removed of all derbies. It bore no relation whatsoever to the normal game, and it was simply because the fans weren't there.
And the match took place, Simon Cooper, some argue, well, because they simply needed the money. What with TV rights tied to the number of games that are played in the Bundesliga.
Yeah, and so football has this enormous financial crisis. As long as you're playing, all your three main sources of revenue, match day, that's mostly tickets, TV income, and then sponsorship, and the sponsors pay because they want to be on TV, your income goes down to close to zero. And so at least with playing on TV, you boost some of that. But football is looking at a kind of deflation in salaries and also transfer fees for as long as this period lasts where you can't have crowds at games. And this could be years. I mean, there's a hopeful prognosis that we'll have a vaccine within the next year. It's also perfectly possible that it could take years. And then I think football has to think, well, clearly we want to play with full stadiums, partly because it looks better on TV and be on TV. If you can't do it in a country like England, maybe you think of moving to a country with your whole league for a year or two where you can do it. And one potential scenario for that is New Zealand, which is virus-free at the moment, and Australia, which is not far off. Because
is that being seriously talked about?
I don't know. If I were them, I would be.
I know it's been talked about for baseball. There was one idea floated of having games played in Florida and Arizona, if it was possible, in front of empty stadiums.
Yeah, I mean, in the US, you have the advantage that you have parts of the country that are virus-free. I mean, similarly in France, you could quarantine everyone and then decamp the league to the southwestern part, where there are places where there is actually no pandemic. But you really want full stadiums. Because I was interviewing someone at Barcelona who said, we don't expect, the main scenario we have is no crowds in the stadium until next February. If there's no vaccine, no crowds, the Dutch health minister has said. So this could be a really, really long spell. And during this spell, football's revenues would plummet. I mean, even if you're playing, if there's no crowds there, as Ian says, as we saw last weekend, it doesn't really look exciting. I mean, it was a big thrill to see the Bundesliga because nobody had seen any football for 2 months. But if you're going to be watching empty stadiums for game after game, it's going to pull pretty quickly.
It's going to fall pretty quickly. And just one final point on this, Simon. at least you have that high TV revenue when it comes to football. I know that top flight rugby teams in France say if we don't have ticket sales, we go under.
Well, this is true of all the kind of less funded leagues. So that's true of women's football. It's true of lower league men's football. They're much more dependent on match day. Women's football, I mean, there is a TV contract which is decent. But if you're a championship football club, without match day, without 25,000 people coming in and buying the tickets and the pies, you're nowhere. So TV without fans can work for the top level, can work for the Premier League, the Bundesliga. Below that, you really need people coming to the stadium.
Carly Telford, the fact that the men and the women are not exactly in sync when it comes to when to restart the season, again, is that an indicator that it's all about money?
Not all about, but it's a big chunk of it. I think that's been a lot of the decisions for most leagues across Spain, Italy, Germany, like you said before. It does come down to money, and at the end of the day, we are funded heavily by the men's team, and a lot of the clubs are. So for us to kind of just keep wanting the kind of men's league to just end, there is part of us that needs it to potentially go ahead just to keep us afloat as well as the other teams. So I think there's a big picture with it. It'll be interesting to see what happens here. The government rules are kind of changing, and if again we keep the R rate below a certain level, there's potential for the Premier League to go ahead, as long as it is to do safely. And again, we're funded by the FA as well, so have the FA got the money to be able to fund the testing, the amount of testing that is potentially going to be needed for it to go ahead, or is it going to be a detriment to our league for the future? We know how important money is going to be to keep the WSL afloat, and is spending a huge amount of money on testing and making sure everyone's safe, the right thing to do at this moment in time. And that's questions that are being asked above my pay grade, and decisions that are having to be made in the next couple of weeks, I'd imagine. But yeah, we are in a position where I think safety comes first for us. We aren't kind of trying to fulfill massive multi-million-pound sponsorship deals that the Premier League, the Spanish League, the Italian League are trying to fulfill to make sure that their league and their teams can stay afloat.
It's got to be heartbreaking on so many levels for you, Carly, because when you look back to last year's World Cup, the women's game has gone from strength to strength. It's more and more televised here in France. I know it's the same where you are. More and more people taking interest, more and more girls playing football in Europe. And now this stoppage and the money issues that Simon Cooper just described, you wonder, is it going to be back to square one?
Yeah, Simon makes a great point, and it's probably only recently over the past couple of interviews that I've done that people have said, "Oh, do you think the women's game is going to be affected because of the men's game?" And that's probably made me think for the first time, well, actually, yeah, like we might, if the men are going to have to take pay cuts in their salaries and their transfer fees, then it is directly going to affect the women's game. I just hope that it doesn't massively. We managed to I know the team at Chelsea were working on individual and separate sponsorship deals away from the men, just because we're at that point where Chelsea have become such a global brand, and women's game is now watched across the world, that we have that opportunity, and hopefully that won't deter, I guess, sponsors still wanting to invest in the women's game. But look, there's also opportunity. If there's going to be a lot more games behind closed doors, is there more opportunity for TV rights investments to have more games televised, which would be an amazing thing. And yeah, for the first time, we actually were selling out crowds mostly every week, 3,000-4,000 people at Kings Meadow, which is unbelievable. And I think our marketing team was saying that we don't give away any free tickets anymore, which is a huge leap. And the fact that might get all taken away, all that hard work, will be a bit of a pill to swallow. But again, the safety comes first of not only us as players, but the fans who are coming to the grounds. But yeah, it's just finding ways. Like most clubs and most kind of businesses, they're going to have to find a different way of doing things if they want to kind of make money and stay afloat. It's not just football.
And following up on that point with you, Ian Holyman, when they decided to cancel the French league, the outspoken owner of Lyon's football club, which on the women's side is a major powerhouse in Europe, he said, well, because his team didn't qualify for next year's Champions League, said, well, if the revenue loss, that's going to be bad for everybody, including the women, he said.
Absolutely. it's very interesting to hear what Carly said. I mean, here in France, women's football has been a relatively big player on the European scene for quite some time, with the likes of Jean-Michel Aulas at Lyon, who's made them into a real European powerhouse. You've got Paris Saint-Germain coming as well. Crowds this season were up 30%, and there's no doubt that is a knock-on effect from last summer's World Cup. I think that interest will actually stay, and of course the women's team are to a certain extent reliant on the money filtering down through the men's team, as Carly described, and 17 of the current 20 Ligue 1 clubs now have a professional women's team, which is already a step forward. Just 3 teams then without a professional women's side now in the elite league in France, which is a huge step forward. I think, and as well at the grassroots level, I think that interest will still stay as a result of that 2019 World Cup and the huge success that it was here in France. At the top level, things now financially may be a little bit more difficult, but I think that the huge impetus that tournament gave and the growth and the momentum that the women's game has developed over the last decade probably will remain quite strong.
All right. Earlier, I asked Carly Telford how her confinement's been going. I want to turn to you, Simon Cooper. You wrote a column last month in the Financial Times where you quoted the writer Nick Hornby in his book, Fever Pitch, when he says, "I have measured out my life in Arsenal fixtures." They say football is something tribal, that it's there's that famous quote by Bill Shankly about how it's not a matter of life and death. It's something much more important. I have written down the exact quote, but it's something to that effect. This period of confinement, has it made you think about your personal relationship to sports and to spectator sports?
I think that for most of us who like football, or I used to love football, now I say I like football, we are able to switch off and go on with the rest of our life and have relationships with people that don't have to do with football. I think football is really important for the mental health of a large number of fans, though, and it's especially people who maybe struggle with other personal relationships, who don't have many other relationships, don't have easy ways to bond with other people. And for them, the ritual of going to the stadium with others or watching in a bar with others, where you don't have to talk about yourself or the other person's emotions, you can just be together, you can have this communal feeling, a kind of ritual in your life that repeats from the age of 7 to the age of 80, a kind of something that never changes. You know what life is like. People die, they get divorced, you change, you grow old. And the one thing that never changes in life, or should never change, is that every Saturday there's football. And now there isn't. And I think for a lot of people, that's a big shock and creates mental health problems that are underestimated, especially maybe among men who tend to have fewer emotional skills, that this one source of community that they had and this source of ritual has been taken away from them. And I think it's really hard for some people.
Yeah, Carly Telford, there was Jurgen Klopp interviewed a few weeks before lockdown began in the UK. And they asked him, well, what should they do and everything? And he interrupted the journalist and said, wait a minute, this is just a game. This isn't as important as, stopping a pandemic. And yet you heard Simon Cooper say, for some people, it is as important.
It is, yeah. And massively, I've had lots of messages from lots of our fans who can't wait for us to be back, who are missing it every weekend, and they just can't wait to see football again. They love the club, they love the players. And yeah, I think Simon makes a great point. It has become people's day-to-day life. It's what they live for. They go to work hard all day, all week, just to go to that football game or to the pub with their friends or to someone, like, say, they can feel in common with and share those kind of emotions. And it's just the build up to that every weekend. And even us as players, like, we train all week for that build up and that emotion and that emotional release of the feeling you get when you cross that white line. It's a feeling that's why you buy into football, why you buy into sport. It's hard to replace that, and it's a lot more than just a game, like Jurgen said. But at the same time, that game doesn't exist if there aren't people to be on the pitch and there aren't people to be in the stands. It's not the same. So he, as well as myself and every other person, knows is the safety of the players and the fans is huge. And I think that when so many people are still dying in England and in this country and around the world, it's very hard to, I guess when Jürgen was asked the question, the death rate in England was still very, very high. And to see kind of a clear picture at that point was probably very difficult when we're in the middle of something that we've never experienced before. So yeah, I think that it is a huge part of people's lives, but I think that we have to sit back in this moment in time and just realize there's a bigger picture. And if we want football to succeed and come back the way we all know it to be, there's going to be steps and there's going to be hardships and there's going to be a process to it. And if we do that too quickly, we might make the process be longer, or we might never get back to what we once knew as the beautiful game.
Yeah, it overrides all. Now, Simon talked about the sort of the mental impact of lockdown. I know that Ian Holyman, I'll confess it, some of my comfort watching at the beginning of lockdown was to look at old football matches. And when you watch France-West Germany from the 1982 World Cup, Schumacher still punches Battiston in the jaw and he still doesn't get a card for it. So it's tough rewatching it a second time. But what do you think about all the people who during this lockdown have been looking at old games?
I can only really echo what Simon and Carly have said. Carly and I are both from the northeast of England, where it's a cliche, but it's also true. Football is an absolute religion. There are many economic problems there, many social problems. But the one thing that people absolutely love and absolutely look forward to is going to watch Sunderland, going to watch Newcastle, going to watch Middlesbrough. It's the one release that they have, that one moment of entertainment. So when that is taken away, at least in the real world, I can see them turning to the, as it were, virtual world or the past glories of those sides. Even myself, a former Sunderland fan, I would say, a lapsed Sunderland fan, shall we say. I went back and looked at the 1992 FA Cup run to the final. We were in the second division, some fabulous games, some fabulous memories. I even got in touch with a long lost friend who I'd gone to the game with. So absolutely understand this nostalgia for the game that once was and that has been a little bit taken away from us in many respects.
Yeah, and during this lockdown, we've discovered that there's more than football to life. Well, there's also basketball. Take a look.
My mentality was to go out and win at any cost.
Jordan is the most talented player in the NBA by far.
The show of the 90s, the team of the 90s. How you doing?
Yeah, it's Simon Cooper, The Last Dance, the last episodes of it airing this past weekend on Netflix and ESPN, breaking all kinds of records for viewership. Your thoughts on this phenomenon about Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls and how people who aren't even that big of basketball fans have been watching?
That's me. I mean, I don't really care about basketball, but I watched the first episode and was really spellbound. I mean, partly because Jordan is so articulate, and partly because in American sports, there's much more access for cameras for journalists. And so you see really kind of surprising behind the scenes footage. And then you have this wonderful tension of a great team that is about to fall apart. And I was thinking, of course, how much of that could you replicate in football? Well, the filming wouldn't have been done in the 80s. And you could go back and find those people and find the footage. But I've always envied that in American sport, is the incredible closeness the journalists could achieve to players. I mean, literally going into the locker room, which you see in that film, which in football is only really starting a bit now as, TV channels demand more access.
Yeah, you have, for instance, Ian Holyman's team there, Sunderland, that's been featured now on a yearly basis on Netflix.
Yeah, and there can be great films made about football. I mean, I'm writing a book about FC Barcelona, and I'm focusing a lot on Messi. How does he do what he does? We kind of take him for granted. We say, oh, genius, but how do you actually beat three men and put it in the top corner? And I've been trying to reconstruct that, and how he's the employee number one of Barcelona, meaning the whole club revolves around him. And although we see him often as this kind of bland figure without a personality, in fact, he's this very powerful, demanding guy who makes a lot of the decisions. So I was comparing him mentally to Jordan. And you could make that kind of film about Messi if Messi were willing to cooperate, but that's just not the football culture of players talking like that.
Have you watched The Last Dance, Carly Telford?
I have, yes. I was sucked into it, and again, I'm very much the same. Not a huge basketball fan, but I do remember when I'm a '90s kid that of watching the film Space Jam. I'm not sure if you know about it, but it was a cartoon based film with Michael Jordan in it. And I remember being a kid, I had no idea who Michael Jordan was, who he played for, but I just thought it was amazing. I remember me, my brother and sister going into the back garden and using something on the wall and pretending we were shooting hoops like MJ. I had no idea Chicago Bulls were, whatever. So to kind of get a refresh and obviously find out as you grow up who this amazing athlete was, but also what he was actually like in his prime and why everyone loved him and why I guess they wanted to make a film about him. And I guess his whole team that surrounded him. It's been amazing to see, and like Simon said, it's weird because football has kind of, I don't know whether that's kind of an evolution of how restrictive we've become about wanting to let other teams know what goes on in the changing room and stuff like that. But that kind of look into the real personalities. And again, there was so many like non-restrictions back then. It's just like you get to see like the real rawness of every single person. And I think that's what makes it so special is like we don't get to see that as much as we want. But as human beings, we crave to see what makes these people special, what their weaknesses are, and generally them just be humans. And I think that's what we forget sometimes about sports people. But this documentary, you get to see everything, the best bits, the worst bits, and what makes the greatest taken. It's been fantastic to watch, and I think it will hopefully knock down some barriers to other teams and individuals, maybe allowing the cameras to see them into their personal lives and what makes them be successful.
Carly Telford mentioning something important there, Ian Holyman, how, when she was young, watching Space Jam, the movie, and being inspired to go outside and emulate. Just like normally right now, we're coming up. Normally this time of year, it would be the French Open, and suddenly you can't find a court that's free because everybody wants to go play tennis. During lockdown, we've seen, people have had to change their exercise habits as a result. Have you changed as a result? I know that you've run marathons before, but has lockdown changed your personal relationship to how you exercise and to how you see sports?
Not my personal relationship to it. No, it's certainly given me more time. I'm very fortunate in the surroundings. There's forests. I was able to go running or cycle in the forests under the strictest lockdown measures and still remain within them and not meet anybody. I think that. I think a friend of mine said to me, and it was really quite, at least a revelation for him, that as soon as lockdown ended, the first thing he was going to do was cancel his gym membership. And I think people have realized that you don't need equipment necessarily to exercise, to be fit. You don't need a machine. What you need is motivation. And the best machine, the best equipment you have, you're already living in it. It's your body. You can use your body in so many ways to develop strength, develop cardiac fitness as well. You don't need this. You don't need the gym membership to become fit. What you need is the motivation, and I think that's what's been lacking. I mean, when I have to say, I kind of had a bit of a laugh. As you mentioned, I've done marathons previously, a long time prior to the lockdown. That requires quite a lot of personal motivation and ambition and fitness, when you also got a full-time job on the side and by no means a professional athlete. But when Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, came out and said, now people can go outside and exercise as much as they want, as if that would suddenly release people to exercise. They'd be running all over the place and cycling. They could exercise as much as they wanted before the lockdown. I don't see them changing immediately to becoming fitness freaks and going out and getting the exercise that, according to the World Health Organization, most of Western Europe needs. About 50% of Western Europe are classed as overweight. I think it's certainly something that we should be looking at, but I'm not sure that even this lockdown period in general. Of course, some people may have road to Damascus moments and see that they need to get fitter, but there have been countless New Year's resolutions about this year I'm going to get fit, and that was prior to the lockdown. I can't see the coronavirus pandemic changing very much in general terms.
All right, I'll argue the point. I'll bring Simon Cooper into the conversation, because when we had the strict lockdown measures up until a week ago here in France, one of the rules was you were allowed to do 1 hour of exercise a day. And I did see on the footpaths some people running who clearly, generally did not jog. Did you experience, Simon Cooper, an uptick in your surroundings of people interested in exercise?
Certainly, I'd never seen so many joggers on the streets of Paris. I mean, jogging, as you know, François, was always considered not done in Paris. You couldn't kind of run around your neighborhood sweating, wearing tracksuit. That's the least Parisian thing you could possibly do. And suddenly now it's okay. And the streets of Paris are full of these people during lockdown. I also think we're all changing our habits. So I was walking around Paris on Sunday, and normally, you know, it was a beautiful day, it was sunny, people would be sitting in cafes all closed. So young people were still gathering outside, but they were hanging around in public spaces like the Bastille, which is now a beautiful square for pedestrians, and also playing jeu de boule, which I'd never seen young people do. It's an old man's game traditionally in France. But when you lose all your old habits, or many of them, you can't meet your friends in a cafe, you can't go to a party, you can't play football with your mates. Well, you start to think of new things to do. So as long as this lasts, I think that there will be a shift towards jogging, jeu de boule. My children, who play on a play street near our house, normally they play football matches. Of course, not possible now. So now they shoot. They kind of shoot at goal or do long passing. So we're all adapting the way that we time.
And Carly Telford, you can add to that list bicycle riding, with some saying they're not going to take mass transit anymore and instead ride bikes. The New York Times this Tuesday with a story that they're sold out in many of the shops in Brooklyn, New York. Do you see a change among the general public?
Yeah, and I think especially in England, I think you look at London, and I think Sadiq Khan is looking at closing a lot of the major routes into London, and people are going to have to find alternative ways of transport. I know the tubes, there's a lot of debate about what's going on with the transport in London at the minute, how full they are with the pandemic and the social distancing. They can't seem to work out or get it right. So I think a lot of people are either jogging, running, cycling, using scooters, different kinds of modes. And what's been nice, I guess, that we haven't experienced in England for a long time is a very nice period of weather. So I think at the minute, jogging, cycling, everything outdoors is great when it's 18, 19, 20 degrees, the sun shining. Whether people will keep doing that when the weather does change and it starts raining and getting colder will be questionable. But it's nice for me, who's active every day. It's very nice to go over to the field and see lots of families, lots of young, old, middle-aged people jogging, running, doing some sort of activity, because again, like Ian said, people have the time on their hands to do that, to do things that they've maybe never done before. I know I've spent a lot of time in the garden, actually planting vegetables and watching them grow, which I've never done before. But yeah, it's kind of filling our time in with stuff that we've never done or now that we're allowed to do. It seems that everybody's become really keen gardeners, and you walk around the streets and there's lots of people mowing their lawns, planting things, doing stuff that they probably never had the time to do. So I think that people are using being active as a way of releasing. We know how key exercise is to mental health and being outside. I think whether you're walking, jogging, cycling is very good at this moment in time when you've probably spent a lot of time inside. So I think that is another keynote, and I think people who haven't done it before are finding that it does actually make them feel better. And hopefully after the pandemic, people will continue to do so, because at the end of the day, it does help you feel better.
Carly Telford, we wish you and your Chelsea teammates a swift return to the old normal. I want to thank you so much for joining us from Wolverhampton. I want to thank Ian Holyman in Giverny, Simon Cooper in Paris. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. There's more on our website, france24.com, Facebook, and our YouTube channel. Bye for now.
3.5 billion people confined in some way around the planet. almost half of the world's population. The COVID-19 pandemic has drastically changed our lives. An end to travel, industry slowed or stopped. So what does that mean for the environment? What impact on efforts to fight for climate change? Join us for this special episode of Down to Earth.
Down to Earth, presented by Mairead Dundas on France 24 and France24.com.
Here at France 24, we're taking a broad outlook by talking about the women who are reshaping our world.
En France 24 en español no tenemos temas vedados. Y eso se puede ver en televisión y en todas las plataformas que tenemos en Internet.
في فرانس 24 لا ننسى ونحجز لكم أسبوعيا تذكرة عودة للمدن والمناطق التي كانت في قلب الأحداث قبل أن تدخل في طي النسيان.
Claro que tiene algo especial. Somos todos de distintos países y trabajamos con todo el corazón para entregar información en el momento preciso.
أخبار سياسية واقتصادية وثقافية وأيضا رياضية بأعين خبراء رياضيين. هذه هي قناة فرانس 24.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.